And being now able to actually meet in person and be here and talk to each other and hug each other is very special. And so I'm super, super happy to say welcome to the Widen the Circle Summer Forum in Berlin in person. And before I introduce you to this great conversation that we're going to be listening to, I want to say a few words about Widen the Circle, because some of you have been involved with us for many years now, but some of you have only recently heard of us and have been invited to this event, so maybe you should know a little bit more about what we're up to. So, Widen the Circle is an initiative, an organization that believes that looking into the past, into a past of discrimination or where injustice happened, and educating about this past is a way to shape a society today in which less hate and less discrimination happens. And so we want to help people who do this kind of work, who look into the past and connect it to the present on a local level, on a community level, on a grassroots level. And we do this in three ways. The first way, many of you probably know, is the giving out the Obermeyer Award. It's the oldest project of the Obermeyer Foundation, which is like the mother of the initiative Widen the Circle. And it has been going on for over 20 years, and actually we have many Obermeyer awardees, award winners sitting here among us, which is really cool. And the Obermeyer Awards are about acknowledging and praising the work that has been done on this local level and making it more visible. And our second program, or the second way we approach this issue, is to build a network of those people who do this work on a local level. Because we believe that by bringing people together and giving them a chance to talk to each other, to learn from each other, to inspire each other, and to just be with each other and encourage each other, helps them continue their work. And that's our way to help increase their impact. And so this is you, the Widen the Circle Network, so I'm really happy that this is happening. And the third program is our newest baby. We call it International Bridge Building. And actually this event is also part of this program, because as our identity as being an American-German organization, we have the possibility to bridge knowledge, to bridge experiences between people doing really important work, countering their own difficult history in both countries. And we believe that also this exchange in a global world is very valuable and actually can help everyone take something back to their work. And this is why we have our visiting program going on in this week, and we have guests from the US experiencing Germany, issues that are going on in Germany, and remembrance culture in Germany. And so this is also what this event is about. It's a network event, so we can talk to each other, but it's also a bridge building event. We can learn from each other, even though we come from different backgrounds, we have different experiences, and we have different histories. And when we talk about we, this is just something that I really have to say, because it's really, that of course this is a group effort. And I just want to everybody to raise their hand, like the team of the Widen the Circle, so you know that we are many people doing this, some more involved, some less. And you can just look around and you will find, mostly over there, people who helped putting this event together. Also Ilona, who is not inside, but actually helped me so much, so thank you. And I just want to give one team member the chance to say hi, because he's also the executive director of Widen the Circle, and carries the name Obermeyer, and that's why I want just Joel, maybe as a representative of the team, to just say hi.
Thank you, Lily. When we first started bringing people together from what has become our network, I want to say 4 years ago, I had no sense that it was going to turn into this. I hoped, but I think this is even more vibrant and more interesting and more deep than I could have even imagined. So I'm super excited to have everyone here. I'm really excited for our program. Lily, the one person who wasn't applauded is you. You put this whole program together, with help, of course. So may we have one more round of applause. Without further ado, let's move on.
Thank you, Joel. That was smooth. Yeah, so I was talking about looking into the past and how understanding the past can help us shape the current society. And so I'm excited that tonight we actually, and we want to fight hate and we want to fight discrimination. And I'm happy that tonight we can actually look at a little bit closer at what we're fighting. Like, what is it in our society that we want to prevent? And so this is why this event today has the title, How to Prevent Right-Wing Populism, with perspectives from both the US and in Germany. And I'm so excited about the speakers we have, because they are really, really great. And I first want to introduce you to Marc Skvirsky. He had been involved with an educational organization in the US, which is called Facing History and Ourselves. And even though he's now retired, he's still very, very active in projects involving social rights issues. And he has supported Widen the Circle in the past months. And we are so grateful for you to support us with your expertise and with your empathy. And I'm really, really happy that you're now the facilitator of this panel conversation. And he will talk first to the second person we have on our panel, Derek Black. Derek Black is an historian, but also he grew up in a right-wing family in the US. And he can talk more about what the ideology of right extremism is like, and how the thinking and how the narratives work. And I'm very, very excited to hear from you and your story, and how you turned away from this and how you actually fight now these ideologies. And the third speaker, who is not up here yet because he will enter the stage later on, is Stephan Conrad. Stephan Conrad works for Treibhaus e.V., one of our this year award winners, and in this association works in Döbeln, a small town in Saxony. And Connie, as he wants to be called, can talk about how he experienced his youth growing up in this town, and how this association really is a safe space for people with a democratic mindset, with non-racist values, and how that can help giving people the chance to refrain from these right-wing ideologies. And with that, I would like to close, and I would like to give you the word, and I'm happy to and curious to hear what you're going to talk about.
Thank you. First of all, I'm thrilled to be here, working with Widen the Circle. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. I've actually been coming back and forth to Germany for the past 30 years and running workshops for teachers on how to teach about issues related to the Holocaust and other forms of dehumanization in the world. So this is sort of coming back, and I was also part of the Widen the Circle, and I experienced the forum 2.5 years ago. So this is wonderful to be here, and thank you, Lily, for the kind introduction. So I'm talking to you right now, but soon I'm not going to be talking to you. I'm going to be talking to Derek. So don't think I'm being rude if my back is to you, but this is going to be a back and forth between us. Just so you know, I want to give you a little bit of context. I know Derek quite well. I met him 5 years ago, and I'll give you the context of how I met him. I was at a Big Ideas festival, and someone ran over to me and said, "Oh, Mark, you have to meet this person, Derek Black." And I had heard about him. There was a big news, an article about him in the newspaper. And I have to say, I was a little leery. I knew about his history, and Lily, you soft pedaled a little bit. The degree that him and his family were involved in this movement, and we'll talk about that. So I had questions. Can someone really change? His words and his actions, how does he deal with that? How do you deal with culpability about what his words have caused in the United States and across the globe in some ways? And so in this big, elaborate, I was in a thing with 500 people on the beach having an elegant dinner, and I said, I'm not going to have a conversation here. I turned to you and I said, can we talk later? And we then went off the next day and talked, and we've been talking for 5 years, and I've been talking on stage with him and talking in a personal way. So this is going to be a continuation, really, of the conversation that we've had. So I just want to lay that context, because sometimes you think, oh, you're talking to this guy for the first time. I'm not. So we're going to do a couple things. One is, I think, to understand today and how Derek thinks, it's really important to go back to understand his background, what he grew up with, some of the transition that happened in his life, and what I have been doing to him every time a massive shooting happens in the States. I call Derek, trying to unpack what is going on, certainly in the United States. So, I'm going to start by reading to you a passage. This is a book about Derek. It's called Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. And this is a passage that Eli Saslow wrote this book, and it's about him when he was in community college, and he was really speaking at a conference, a white supremacist conference, a white nationalist conference, and we can talk about the difference, in Memphis, Tennessee. And the person who's introducing him, and I'm trying to give enough context, but if I'm not, raise your hand, is David Duke. And David Duke is a white supremacist, a conspiratorial person around anti-Semitism. He used to be head of the Ku Klux Klan, and it's also his godfather. His mother was married to him, so his step-sisters are the daughters of David Duke. So here we go. The future of our movement is to become fully mainstream, Duke told the crowd. So he reserved one of the conference's keynote speeches for an up-and-coming white nationalist leader who represented the future. I'd like to introduce the leading light of our movement, Duke said. I don't know anybody who has better gifts. He may have a much more extensive national and international career than I've had. Derek, can you come up? Duke motioned to the corner of the room where a 19-year-old community college student was hunched behind a laptop running a live radio broadcast of the event for the online radio station he started himself. We're so privileged to be with you, Duke said before turning back to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Derek Black. The crowd began to applaud, and Derek stood from his computer with a slight wave and walked to the front of the room. Most of the white nationalists already knew him, because how could they not? He was at least a generation younger than anyone else, with shoulder-length red hair and a large cowboy hat that he wore in an effort to make himself more memorable. He'd grown up within the insular world of white nationalism, attending dozens of conferences like this one. Already he had built his own website for white children of the globe, visited more than 500,000 times. He launched a 24-hour online radio network for white nationalists and won a local election as a Republican in Florida. He was not only a prodigy prodigy within the movement, but also a product of it. His father, Don Black, led the Klan for nearly a decade, and then created Stormfront, the internet's first and largest white pride website. His mother, Chloe, had once been married to David Duke, and Duke acted as Derek's mentor and godfather, sometimes referring to Derek as the heir. So now we're going to turn around.
Mark?
So,
Wait a second.
I need to come up with, sorry, I'm not Chef des Clans für fast 10 Jahre für den Clan und hat danach die Sturmfront gegründet, die erste große Internetplattform für Widen. Also Lito Chloe war für verheiratet mit dem Duke und Duke war Derek's Taufpaar. Sorry,
no, that's
thank you,
fine.
thanks a lot.
The person who's doing the simultaneous translation, at time we're going to have to sort of slow down to make this work for everybody. So Derek, you were entering 3rd grade, and your parents pulled you out of school, and you were homeschooled. And really, when I read the excerpt and talked about the insular life, you truly lived an insular life. Everything that was surrounding you had sort of a white nationalist identity. Your friends, the family, the things you did. Can you describe what it was like growing up? What did you believe? How did you look at the world? And just give a little context.
So, this is working? No, I don't think so. Yeah, it's okay. Is it on?
No, but you can have this one.
So it was intensely insular, but not necessarily in the ways that you might imagine. It was not rural, it was not disconnected. I lived in South Florida, which is one of the most densely populated and multiracial, diverse parts of the United States. And yet, my existence felt consumed by the identity that I wanted to inherit and take up. By the time that I was born, my family had already spent decades building the white nationalist movement. That when I was 9 years old, I attended one of the campaigns, one of the later political campaigns that David Duke was running in Louisiana when he was running for Congress. And when I was there, I saw marches of thousands of people showing up to malls and street corners and chanting these white nationalist statements, even though they were just regular, average white people from Louisiana. And I heard all the stories of the campaigns that he had won, and I saw the website that my dad had founded the year that I was born, which by that point had grown to be the largest community online and made it the central gathering place for white nationalist thought, not just in the United States, but internationally. It was translated into many languages. We had 30,000 people regularly participating and hundreds of thousands who participated over time. When I was about 10 years old, I finally convinced my father to start taking me with him to conferences, which are also not necessarily what you might imagine. They were held in 5-star hotels with banquet halls and gala dinners at the end. They had suit and tie requirements and expensive registration fees. We pulled in tenured professors from universities around the world to come and talk about their pseudoscientific views of race to sort of justify this 19th century biological essentialism and Darwinism. It was a world that tried to build this facade of being factual and also being ideologically brave. And I grew up in this community of people who saw themselves as the only people who were willing to speak up against tyranny and destruction and all these things that they described as being essentially the apocalypse, and that they had this clear view of the world. And as I grew, I wanted to hear the stories that my parents had participated in, all the decades of things that they had done before I was born. And there were lots of other kids who showed up to events like that. And I slowly found myself to be the only one who was sitting in the front when people were giving speeches. I'd have friends who would invite me to go to the hotel pool, and I would stay there and listen to people and then go with them to the restaurants afterwards and try to hear all the stories over decades. There were people who had led and organized against Martin Luther King in the 1960s. There were people who remembered the legacy of this movement going back into the 1950s. And there was a feeling of not just defeats, but also victories politically and organizationally, and this feeling that this was a moment that would really decide the future for their movement. And so I took up that mantle.
So I'm very conscious that, you know, we're not in the States now, we're in Germany, and some of the context might be a little different. So could you, before we go on, could you give a little bit of a definition about the difference between, or is there a difference between white nationalism and white supremacy and replacement theory? Can you just sort of unravel some of that a little bit, and then we can sort of continue?
I think the most important part of an answer to that question is to remember that all of these terms have their origin within the white supremacist, white nationalist movement itself. That we are, without exception, using terms that they at one point or another embraced or created. And as you go back, you find terms that they don't use anymore, like white supremacist, that were deeply embraced in the 1950s and the 1960s on campaign posters and that won elections. But then as time went on and these terms become more marginalized, more toxic, they would drop them and they would adopt new ones. My father is the one who popularized white nationalism, and for the most part, I think it's become the most common term that the mainstream media uses to describe it. And I use it too because I think that it is descriptive. It is a term that can define a movement as opposed to white supremacy to talk about the way that racism it works throughout society. And white nationalism is a movement of people who you can't quite count them, but you can say that they're in the tens of thousands, and you can define them in pretty vague ways, but ways that are pretty clear in the moment by the events they come to, the literature they read, the heroes that they all know, the symbols that they all know. And so we're using terms, I think it's always good to be cautious about it. There are some people who prefer to call it the white power movement, and I don't have any particular problem with that. It's also a term that people use. White nationalism was the one that I grew up within, and it was the one that my dad really embraced. And I don't think that there's too much danger, at least in English-speaking circles, of hearing white nationalism and thinking that it's innocuous. So I use it with some level of caution because some of these terms are difficult to pin down. But the thing that I think is absolutely essential is to understand that it is, at root, a social movement with an ideology, with a shared history, and with no international borders.
So, you know, when we first started talking, I was afraid of what's happening in the United States, but now I'm petrified about what's happening in the United States. And if you think about white nationalism and replacement theory, the idea that people of color are going to replace white people, and so, you know, there has to be even more push to try to push people away and restrict immigration and all of that. and you see what's happening in the States right now. Can you talk about, and I know this is hard, when we talked about, yes, extremism is a small nucleus of radical extremism of maybe the tens of thousands, maybe not even that. But then you have these concentric circles of people who go to your father's website that might not be part of one of these movements. And then you start to hear Fox News that has now 3 million people a night listening to Tucker Carlson, if not more. Can you just describe the layers of how this ideology is seeping into culture?
So I think it's also important to start with just defining what the ideology is.
Yeah.
Because that's how you identify the ways that it permeates into mainstream culture. And then also the tactics that they intend to use. The core of white nationalism is really twofold. And I think it sometimes surprises audiences, and I'm not sure if it will surprise this audience. But I am regularly confronted by the fact that I sit in rooms, particularly in the United States, where people are oriented around anti-racism as an issue of whiteness and anti-blackness and immigration, or rooms where people are focused on anti-Semitism. And it seems rare that I'm ever in rooms where people who are advocating for both of these pretty large movements seem to work together. And white nationalism is a locus for both intense racism, a belief in biological races, a belief that they can define it and describe it through IQ and crime statistics and all of these sort of pseudoscience.
Sorry. So can you repeat? Sorry, it was a bit too quick. It got a bit too quick.
Sure.
So from when you started,
This movement is defined, I think, primarily by its race essentialism. Its belief that races are biologically and culturally real, and that they define society and they define populations, and that they can prove it through all of this false misused statistics. But that would not drive the movement without its intense core of anti-Semitism. And I think that that's the part that tends to surprise audiences, that anti-Semitism is the driving motive for the movement, both internationally especially, but also well within the United States and in my experiences. Their belief is firmly held. Their belief is true to themselves. They're not trying to trick people through a crazy conspiracy. They firmly believe that all Jewish people in the world are aware of a conspiracy to advocate for immigration into Europe and the United States, and that this strategy is intended to attack white people, which is my experience, it wasn't called replacement theory. That's a term that I think has become more popular, but it went by many names. I was in a group that really loved the term white genocide to describe immigration and racial marriages. And that belief, the belief that it is specifically individual Jewish people and all Jewish people who are involved in a conspiratorial international movement to advocate specifically for immigration and specifically for media that promotes integration, is the driving force behind how they organize, is the driving force behind all of their beliefs about race. And without it, it doesn't make sense as a cohesive ideology. And then strategically, the goal of the movement is to take these ideas and recognize that they are not marginal, that they are not unknown in mainstream society, to find the more innocuous versions of them that are being repeated by people at kitchen tables or by local politicians or sometimes national politicians, to find the wedges in a society that advocates anti-racism so often, and to try to pry those things open, to get people who already hold more average racist or anti-Semitic beliefs to embrace those beliefs, to adopt and be willing to take on the label of racist, or at least to not be afraid of being called racist. And to try to get those messages into a wider audience and convince mainstream politicians to use them.
So if you, and we'll do this quickly so I can sort of move through this, but if you think about where the United States was even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and where it is now in terms of sort of seeds of that ideology, how do you see that changing?
I mean, I think it's inarguable that it is, that specific phrases that have been devised and promoted over decades are being used in mainstream political slogans at a greater rate than at any time, at least in the last 30 years. And it's a movement that has a longer time frame than that. It's a movement that views itself as going back to the 1950s. And so they see peaks and troughs in intense, explicit white supremacy in mainstream politics and media. And depends on which person in the movement you ask about whether they think that they're really at a moment that's leading to something big, but I think any of them would admit that having the most popular news show in the United States regularly repeat lines taken directly from their movement and have writers on the show regularly exposed as being members of the movement is something that shows their basic thesis is correct, that their ideology is not just directly repulsive to mainstream society, that it's something that they can package and hone and get a lot of response from. And I think more than anything strategically, that's their core belief, and they would say that's validated all the time.
So let's get back to you in your personal story. So you were in community college, and then you're transferring to another college, a full 4-year college, and you choose probably the most liberal college in all of Florida, New College, and you go with sort of a hidden identity, and so your mornings are spent, early mornings, on Stormfront's radio show, doing all of this, and then you go to these classes. First of all, why did you go to New College? I mean, did you go to New College to convert people to your ideology, or why did you do it?
I went for more mundane reasons, that my family really believed in education, and within the system, within Florida, the university system can be incredibly expensive. And this was an honors college, a small liberal arts college, which was different from the bigger universities and had programs that really focused on history, that really focused on medieval history, which I was interested in. And I believed that my ideology was just unshakable. Not because I thought, I wanted to remain ignorant, but because I thought that I was basing everything in this hard and obvious facts, and that other people were basing it in their desires or their feelings or their empathy, but that unfortunately, if they wanted to accept these realities, then if they wanted to face the truth, they could do so, and that therefore I was unconvincible because I was the only one who was facing what was.
Sorry, it's quick.
Sure.
You were going to the university with your belief unshaken. You just wanted to test the waters, or?
That I believed that I could get an education and not have my mind changed. And I think it was not me seeking to have anything changed. If anything, it was to maybe understand leftist opinions better while I was there.
So you're in college, at New College. The mornings are spent doing your radio show, hateful radio show. And then, I'm going to truncate the story a little bit for time, but you're exposed. And there is huge, the college breaks out into protest, wanting you to get the hell out of that school. How dare you be in this institution? So that's going on, and there are then some kids in your class invite you over to dinner for Shabbat dinner. What is that about? Why did you go? And what happened at those dinners?
I had spent one semester there with nobody recognizing anything about my background. And I didn't necessarily see myself as lying to anybody. I just never brought it up. I was quite well known if you Googled my name. I had run for office before I started college, and I was in national newspapers because my seat had been denied, and I had advocated all these white nationalist things, even winning in South Florida. And so once I realized that these people I was making friends with were really not going to take this well, I sort of became terrified of what was going to eventually happen. I had been in situations where people did not agree, to put it lightly, and had anti-racist opinions. And in every case, when my identity became clear to them, they usually didn't do much. They usually would change the subject or maybe distance themselves. And it became clear that this community was deeply invested as a community in anti-racism, in social justice. And once I was exposed, I immediately started watching hundreds of pages of condemnations of people who I had made friends with over these months, sort of not just back away, but condemn me, and watching these relationships implode, that they felt like they had been deceived. But I think it's also part of those relationships that I made that explains how that Shabbat dinner came to be, that the person who invited me wasn't a stranger who was watching those threads. It wasn't somebody who I knew well, but it was somebody who we had exchanged phone numbers. We had shared study guides for a class that we had during the semester I was there. And so when he texted me, it felt at least possibly genuine. We knew we had some kind of relationship, and I think, to be fully honest, there weren't that many invitations, and I showed up. I thought it was going to be once. I thought it was going to be one Shabbat dinner, and then I thought they were probably going to yell at me.
So, all right, people are outraged on campus. There's massive demonstrations. You're going to the Shabbat dinner, but one of the people who lives in the suite, Allison, refuses to have anything to do with you or anything to do with the Shabbat dinners anymore, because she's not Jewish, but she was part of this community, and so she leaves or stays in her room, and then at some point into the future, she decides that she shouldn't just sit there. She wants to go out and sort of confront you a little bit, with have a conversation, or to confront you. I can't describe it. I wasn't there. What happened? And this was, all of these are seeds. I'm talking about this not just to have a story. If we think about change, these are different seeds that were sort of impacting you. Can you talk about what happened with Allison, and how did your ideology start to be in question at that point, and how did that evolve over time?
The way that she would describe her motivation is that she saw me coming back. And she also saw that nobody at the dinners was directly challenging my beliefs. Like, they had planned to that first night, and I was incredibly reticent. We all had sort of a stalemate. And after that, the organizer, still my good friend, and we live in the same city to this day and have Shabbat dinners at each other's houses, he just told people not to bring it up, because there were massive condemnations. There was a school shutdown and a teach-in that was not just inspired by me, but in part was. I was getting middle fingers whenever I went to the library, but I was still there. And so she would describe it as saying she knew and recognized that nobody was talking to me, that people were making it very clear that I didn't belong, and other people, like her roommate, were inviting me to a space that he described as inherently challenging. His belief was that coming to a Shabbat dinner is inherently challenging, and I'm not going to get into some kind of debate that he didn't necessarily feel like he would win, because he didn't have a doubt that white nationalism was stupid, but he also hadn't debated it his whole life. And Allison saw herself as not a marcher, as not a public activist, and she also didn't want to be conciliatory, and she didn't want to make my life on campus comfortable. And so her way of threading that was to, come by. We talked, and her question was, your demeanor, the fact that you attend this Shabbat dinner where half of the attendees are people of color, and it's a very diverse situation. It seems incongruous with your beliefs. How exactly do you square that, and would you be willing to explain them to me? And that was how she started that conversation. And it's a long story, but then it proceeds over the next couple of years where there are lots of conversations, both after the one where I explained, here's what I believe, and she heard in it that I believed that I had evidence and facts, and being a very rational debater, she said, oh, well, I can change your mind, I can confront facts. If you think that your belief system is supported by statistics, I've taken statistics classes, I can debate this. I know you're wrong, and I'll prove why.
What can I say? Because I know Allison quite well. They're actually married now. But I think what, to me in this story, what is so interesting is that Allison didn't know how to refute what you were doing. She spent her evenings going to the library and doing research so she could go back to you with a rational and factual way of unpacking your ideology. So how did that, was it like one day you woke up and said, oh, I'm not a white nationalist anymore, or how did that evolve? And how did that, because right now, you're a very active anti-racist person. So how did this happen?
She recognized that I saw myself as being scientific and curious and open to hearing things. And you could hear the story and rightly recognize that I clearly wasn't, because it wasn't the first time that people had said, racism is stupid and white supremacy is dumb and hurtful and harmful and incorrect. But it was the first time that I was ever going to be listening to why. And so those 2 years had lots of arguments about, here's something that I believe is evidence from the conference that I attended since I was 10 on crime statistics. How do you look at different racial and immigration crime statistics? And she would break it down and say, race does not predict crime. We do the same thing for intelligence or whatever else that people use to try to prove race is real, biologically predictably real. We would have these sort of logical things, and I did not come away from them saying, well, I was wrong, I'm not going to take that out. But we'd sort of come back a couple months later, and I would say, yeah, that was, I read some of the articles, we talked about it, it's actually bad evidence, and I don't want to use bad evidence. And so I would take that piece out. And it felt like losing a tool in a logic toolbox, but it didn't undermine my belief system. And then that was combined with very emotional arguments where the case was I was living in a community where I regularly heard that my presence, the things I was saying, that the actions of me and my family were actively harming people who I called friends. And that was not cohesive, that I couldn't believe an ideology that harmed people who I supposedly was friends with. And I started out with this worldview that I could interact and hang out and talk to and be friends with anyone because an individual thing was different from these beliefs about millions of people. It was this like logic your way into believing anything. And she would come back and say that there's no line here. There's nothing about groups of people that isn't individuals, that isn't families, that isn't neighborhoods. What do you believe about a group of people that is not the relationships that you're in right now? And accepting both the factual, curious, scientific things that I thought were justifying my belief system, and in retrospect, more importantly, accepting that the community that I cared about was not misunderstanding me, but was right when they said that.
Sorry,
Yeah.
excuse me.
I apologize.
I got that. Sorry, if I ask it. I got you said you had this. Sorry, you saw those many friends of yours in the big movement, and so you were struggling to accept that this was wrong. And Alison always came just because there are 10,000 speaking it, that doesn't make it right. Was it this? Sorry.
That I had justified that I could be individual friends with people who my ideology, and my family's ideology, exiled, condemned, said didn't belong, and that accepting that the emotional connection.
You were part of the big movement, but Entschuldigung, viele, Derek sagt, er war auch, als Teil dieser Bewegung war er trotzdem mit Menschen befreundet, von denen die Bewegung ausging, dass sie eigentlich nicht dazugehörten, dass sie eigentlich, er war quasi in der Bewegung mit den falschen Leuten befreundet. You were friends with those people who your movement did not approve of, and so that was the emotional part, dilemma of you. So yeah, wie er sagte, sorry, er sagte, dass es gab diese Freundschaften mit Menschen, die eben außerhalb dessen standen, dass diese Bewegung, diese riesengroße Bewegung, sorry, can we start again? Sorry.
Well, let me do this,
Yeah,
and we'll go it slow, and we'll do, So Derek has many things happening in his life. He has the protests, he has people sort of, Allison building a relationship with him over time to sort of take on some of his ideology and have conversations. And he's having these friendships. So if you think about all the things that are happening, which one would you say is having the biggest impact? Or can you separate them in terms of what you do? So if you could answer that succinctly, and then what was the action? What got you to the point to really take an action?
In retrospect, it was all of them. At the time, I would have said, oh, it's just the personal conversations, it's just the kindness. And in retrospect, it was very clearly that a community that I cared about was telling me not only that I was wrong, but that I was morally, ethically, and personally harming them. And that did not immediately force me to change my mind. It took lots of debates and discussions and things that felt very factual. But over time, being in a context where I had to face the realities, the impacts of my beliefs, along with a space where I could have them be challenged in a way that I could finally hear, led me to realize that it was the community that held me within my family's belief, that it was just the community that I
So
grew up in.
so one is we change our thinking and people influence us, but it's very different to then act. So what was your first action that put yourself out there, which in some ways started to break the bond with your family? I mean, every single, if you go back to the beginning of the conversation, it's almost every part of your life before, New College is your parents and the people who are part of this movement. So you had to take an action that broke that and broke the bonds in some ways between the community that you had grown up with. So what was it and how did you deal with it?
Ultimately, it was feeling that I had to make a public statement. I wanted to just not believe it anymore. I wanted to fade away and not speak again. And it was one last conversation that I could not undo my words and actions by silence, that I had to push back against them, and that anything less was morally indefensible. But writing that letter meant breaking with my community. And I think that was the moment that became the most clear that it wasn't so difficult to change my mind, to be faced with new facts and new beliefs, to expand the universe of people that I cared for. But it was incredibly difficult to break with the community of people who I had cared for the first 2 decades of my life. And that's what condemning it had to mean. And I think that was the moment that became very clear what it means to even believe something is to answer the question of who do you care for, who is your community.
So, I mean, this is...
Sorry, I need a moment. Also, am Ende merke ich noch. So you were, sorry, excuse me. You wrote a letter and...
A public letter, yes.
Ich schrieb einen offenen Brief, in dem ich mich von den Vorstellungen distanzierte. Und das war für mich so der Punkt auf the point of no return, der Punkt, wo ich nicht mehr dann auch zurückkommen wollte. Sorry, thanks.
Okay, so this is a question that we've talked about in the past, but it's always the hard question, and when I face what's happening and you hear about the African American community that were murdered in Buffalo, you think about the people who were murdered in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, you think about the church in North Carolina where people were murdered. The words of white nationalism is embedded in there. So how do you live knowing that your words caused harm? I mean, and I know the work that you're doing, and you're very outspoken, and the research that you do is extraordinary, but still you're living with your words have caused so much damage. How do you live with that?
I mean, there is no end point or reconciliation. There's also no way for me to even define the damage done, that it almost feels infinite sometimes, because I see words and phrases that I helped popularize in the manifestos of killers, and I can never take any of them back. I think the only thing that I find as a acceptable action is not to be silent, because it is a movement that thrives and bases all of its energy in speaking, in pushing ideas, and it's a fallacy to think that these ideas go away with time. They only go away, they only are defeated by active speaking, active engagement, active community building, and I think that my role is insignificant in comparison to the harm, and I think I often feel that way, but I also don't see any other way to move forward than to speak against.
So I'm going to ask you just one more question, then we'll have a conversation after, Connie comes up and we can talk with him a little bit. But you're now working on a book, and you made it clear you didn't want another memoir, another, your story, because, a lot of it's written in this book. But it will be, the first chapter will be somewhat of a memoir to give a context, but part of what you're writing is I think, it's about, at least in our conversation, we can be more clear, about why this movement is so powerful, what they're doing in terms of persuasion, trying to unpack what we're experiencing in the United States and probably across the globe. So can you just do a brief summary of what you're working on right now?
That my experience, both as an organizer and speaker within white nationalism and as a person who was spoken against, was active, was condemned and ostracized and had to face my own actions, has taught me that we often misunderstand how identity and persuasion are so deeply connected and how they function. And I think that this movement, and I think others too, but this movement particularly understands that using facts and arguments are a tactic, but that in the end it is a sense of belonging and identity and community that drives all ideology, that drives action and movement. And their strategy is not to argue people out of whatever belief they have. It is to offer a sense of place, either within the movement itself or in larger society, to have an idea of their own identity, to embrace it at the expense of others, and to embrace a worldview that can justify just about any harm to preserve that sense of community. And I think that that is something that anti-Semitism sometimes miss, that belief is not something you can argue someone out of. I thought I was being argued out of it, and I recognized that I was not. I was attached to a community that forced me to decide whether I would be identified by a community that condemned them, or whether I would change who I believed I was by expanding that community. And I think that connection between who you care about and who you view within your obligations and how you act and what you believe are in many ways the same question. And I think that is a lesson about how we change things that my experience has shown me.
Let me ask one more before Connie. Where's Connie? Let me just ask one more question. In this room, are extraordinary people. They're people who have really confronted the past in their communities and tried to figure out how they could bring memory alive, how they could bring their communities into a sense of empathy and confrontation at the same time with the past. So how do you think, this Widen the Circle network sort of impacts community and how people think about change? It's a tough one. And they probably have, we could open it up here and it could go on forever, but just your thoughts about that.
I can't speak for anyone other than myself, but I've been shocked by how much I've found. I mean, it sounds like I'm being complimentary or something, but I have been shocked at how deeply emotional I have found the combination of people and place and story here. And I think that has to be a common experience. Just, I knew coming in it would be good conversation. I knew coming in that it would be enlightening. I knew that I would learn things, and I knew that I would see things I hadn't seen before. But I wasn't quite expecting just like how profound it would feel to do something as simple as visit, stand outside the Reichstag and hear, various Berlin history, but with people who were so deeply engaged with it, who thought about it, who thought about their role in it, and who thought about all the relationships and connections in their life and how their knowledge of the past was informing how they wanted to act with the people around them, both for now and for the future. I think being in community, in a space of people who think about community, I think it's I'm not sure there is anything more powerful.
Well, why don't you move to that seat? Connie's going to come up, and then we'll have first a conversation with Connie, then a three-way conversation.
Well, if you ask me, we should skip my part and.
No, well, you're not asking me. Don't you? Anyways, so you're not just gonna. We're gonna set a context here. So Connie, we will open it up for the three of us, but before we do that, I just have a few questions. One is, and maybe this is really particular for the Americans in the audience, could you sort of briefly set the context about right-wing populism in Germany? I mean, Derek did a great job of sort of unpacking a little bit, but how is it playing out? And then we're going to talk a little bit about you that you probably don't want to talk about, but we still will talk about it.
All right. So, excuse me, I got a sheet of paper with some notice on it. I could speak open in German, but I have to do it in English, so I need this to get it. Well, official statistics since 1919 count 110 death cases that have been murdered by neo-Nazis in Germany. But unofficial statistics count 218 and 17 suspicious cases. So actually it's a really big thing since 1919. The difference between back in the days, let's say from 1919 until the 2000s, and now is that back in the days we had the NPD, the National Party, Democratic Party, like a right-wing party, not a populist party, extremist party. And there have been the so-called Baseballschlägerjahre. This means a time where neo-Nazis walk around with baseball bats to hit their political enemies. And I can remember times like these in Dublin, in a small town in Saxony. Some of you will join me there and meet me there again. So back in the days it was fights on the streets. It was, if you have an other political opinion, you should be scared. That was their goal. It's called intimidation, right? So that was part in the 90s, and we had the NPD, we had the Republicans, which was a right-wing party, and we had DSU. There have been demonstrations and violence. I remember that group of neo-Nazis showed up at festivals or at youth clubs or at concerts to beat the shit out of the people there. And I would say that lasted at least in East Germany till the 2000s, and then our former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, he said, we need an Aufstand der Anständigen, we need a rebellion of the decent in October 2000. And since then, programs and projects founded by the government, give civil society association like the Treibhaus, money to monitor, to build up networks, and also to help victims. And that was also the time when the NPD, which was really a big issue in Saxony, was voted into the parliament. And we had a right-wing extremist party from 2004 till 2014 in our region parliament, in the Saxony parliament. In Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, in the northeast of Germany, there was the NPD in the parliament from 2006 till 2016. The populist party, the AfD, which is now a big deal, it's only existed since 2013. And mainly since 2015, when thousands of refugees come to Germany or to Europe to have a safe space, the AfD started as a political party who tries to fight the euro and the EU. In 2015, they changed the main topic and they were against refugees. Then Corona showed up and they were mainly against Corona. And now the Russian started a war against Ukraine and suddenly they are against Ukraine and for Putin. So,
Do you see this as a growing movement, or do you think it's becoming a little more marginalized here, whereas in the United States it's growing rapidly?
So in the 90s it was a closed group and they tried to get more members by violence. Nowadays it's dangerous, but not as dangerous that I can get hit in the face. But they have more attention through media, and that's really, it's less violence, more influence in parliaments, and also more attention through media. And I think that's the problem, because it's not. They also talk about Umvolkung. That's the replacement theory. That's how it's called in Germany. They still believe it, but they don't say it. So more and more people vote them. They get money as a party that's in almost every parliament, and they can make more and more work, like network work like we do here, but with completely different topics. So I think today it's more dangerous for the future. Back in the days it was dangerous for here and now, you know?
So let's go back a little bit to you're a youth worker, you spent a lot of work with working in youth and community where there was a lot of right-wing extremism. And you grew up in that community, and when we talked on the phone, several weeks ago, you were talking about some pivotal moments that you had as a teenager that sort of led you to do this kind of work. Can you share a little bit?
Well, I was born in 1985, so I went to kindergarten in a communist country, and then suddenly the world changed in East Germany, and our parents had troubles with themselves. They lost their jobs, they had to find new opportunities in life in a capitalist state then. And so it was the wild East, the wild East, And we all have been searching. And in the 90s, on our playground where we played Fußball, I don't call it soccer. I will never call it soccer. When we played Fußball, then these Nazi skinheads showed off with these jackets and the baseball bats and their boots, and they bought us cigarettes. So that was impressive. Like, nobody bought me cigarettes when I was 13, 14, but they did. So that was pretty cool. And suddenly I asked my mom to buy me some jackets and some boots, and I kind of felt like, oh yeah, they are strong, they are tough, I want to be like that. But then I met a punk called Schmali. And suddenly I realized it's a better life if you are open-minded. It makes more fun, you can get more friends. Yeah, and that was like the point where I was never, it was never an ideology that I was just walking with them. But with that punk, Schmali, he took me to the first concerts, and I get to know the people who called themselves Antifa. And I realized that these people are better for me and my community. And these people founded the Treibhaus, the association where I work until now. And the Treibhaus founded Safe Space, our Café Courage. It's our meeting point. And since 2001, you can come to us and be whoever you want to be. Punk, goth, skater, hip-hopper, whatever. So, and you don't have to be afraid to get beat up by Nazis like in the 90s.
So so I'm gonna say something, but push me back, because I'm trying to make sense of this. Is your philosophy at Treibhaus almost what Derek was talking about, like building a sense of belonging? Or is the philosophy to sort of take apart white right-wing extremism? How are you working with youth in terms of trying to get people more active in their community? I think I know, but I think just expand a little.
So we don't work with people who are decided to be right-wing. Our work is only prevention. We try with all our projects and programs to prevent people to vote for the wrong party and to march on the wrong demonstrations. So, and we do this on different levels. So since 2001 we have the Café Courage as a safe space where most of our programs took place. Since 2003 we are monitoring right-wing activities in our region. Since 2004 we make councils for refugees. Since 2007 we make political education, and since 2010 we make remembrance work. And so much more.
2005 Hilfe für Flüchtlinge und 2007
Politische Bildung angefangen.
Sie haben es gehört, es liegt mir auch politische Bildung an. Danke, sorry.
So now you've switched a little bit in your role. You know, you were more of a youth worker. Now you're doing a lot of research on the Jewish past in your community. No, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But how do you see that feeding into I guess it's creating a different type of community where you live? What are you going to be doing with this research? And how do you think it's going to impact people?
Well, we started researching, I have to tell, you know, when I studied social work in 2010, we had a really good professor, and he took us to Gedenkstätten. Memorial sites, like Großrosen or Buchenwald. And my colleague Sophie, which is a good friend, and now we live together, she and we asked ourselves what happened during National Socialism in our town. And so we started collecting everything that was done before us and bringing everything together. But we are not historians, so our goal was not to write another book that someone is reading. Our goal was, how can we get this knowledge into people's heads? And so we started to make city trips and starting programs with schools, so half-day programs. And we published also a book, and you can find it there on the table and some stuff. And that's part of the game. Like, we just show what happened and talk with interested people or pupils about it, and hope to show them that that what happened in the past should not happen in the future, and that a democratic society and open-minded heads are better than closed up.
So let's start by opening this up to each other. I mean, well, let's say the two of you, because do you have questions? Do you have comments for each other, knowing the work that both of you are doing? I mean, Derek is, I mean, I have such respect for you, Derek. I think you know that, even though sometimes I ask you, you know, really hard, you know, pointed questions. I can't imagine growing up like that and sort of shifting and losing a family in some ways and your whole identity. And you know, Connie, you know, your work as a youth worker, I couldn't have more respect for. But I would curious how you are understanding each other's stories, and if you have questions for each other, maybe we'll start there, then we can open it up to the larger group.
Well, can I start? Yeah. I think you said it before, but I have to ask it again. How hard was your transformation? Like for your personal, like, do you had fights with yourself in your head?
It was not ever. I really look back on it and I say that in retrospect, it's easy to change my beliefs. Like it's not. It takes a lot of work, but in comparison, beliefs are not so impossible to change. It is attachment to people and spaces, and that was incredibly difficult. And so the conflict wasn't, am I right or wrong? The conflict was, am I prepared for the loss of my entire family and all of my relationships? Because it felt like stepping into a void, and there's nobody there waiting. And so I think we sometimes expect, you know, that like belief change is, you're like, how could I be so wrong? And I do think those things, but I feel fairly confident about beliefs because I've recognized that they come from commitment to people.
So you had never doubts?
I mean, there were years of belief change, and so I always doubted during that point, and I would take that piece by piece. But the really hard thing was when I was confident all my beliefs are wrong and different, and I believe different things. The confirmation of that was condemnation of people. I think that's, and I didn't have doubts about it because it was, if I was factually wrong and morally wrong and harming people who I cared about, I felt like I had an obligation, and so I knew what was right. It was just, was I prepared to do it? Could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The space that I come from feels more, I mean, it directly was often very political, and so it feels almost more like the space that you were talking about at the beginning about fear for the future. And I was always very aware as an adolescent and then as a young adult about this relationship, particularly within the United States, but also as aware of its international European connections to just on the ground, either youth movements or street violence or skinhead concerts and these sort of things, which always felt hard for me to
Just slow down a little.
I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the last?
Yeah, that I did not understand exactly the connection between youth movements and street violence and concerts and these like spaces with powering the political movement. It was always very clear that it did, and I couldn't quite understand the connection exactly. And so my question is, the work you're doing is with youth, with the community, with street level people. And I wonder about your thoughts on the connection between that and this, AFD political situation and future in the region and in the country.
What was the question now? I didn't get it.
Yeah. Maybe the connection between the power of the right wing to convert and embrace youth, particularly like poor youth, like people who don't necessarily have education, and these sort of local and national elections, because there's clearly an energy and power to these political movements from those youth movements, and yet they feel so different.
I think I got it now. So I think I got it. One of the reasons why the AfD is really strong in elections in our region, especially, is because all these skinheads from the 90s are now grown up and voting for the AfD. So you still have like the same people who are back in the days on the streets and beating the shit out of people are now still right extremists, or maybe only populists nowadays. So you see these concerts back in the days, the right-wing concerts, put up a movement that still exists. And that was part of our association to set a counterpart and making offers to people not to go to Nazi concerts or skinhead concerts or move to the next village festival to search for people of color and also harm them. Is it?
Yeah, no, I think that answers it.
So let's just take a couple questions from the audience. I'm sure there's a lot being covered here and a lot of context building that we tried to do, but maybe it didn't totally translate. But if anyone has a question, so there's someone.
I have a question for Derek. Have you ever had any positive feedback? Have you ever had any positive feedback of people who were in the white nationalist movement that you were connected with? Do you think you've been able to influence those people as well in the community that was formerly so important to you?
I heard of definitely some individuals who, when they themselves were distancing or leaving their old belief systems, would say they had watched, interviews. But in general, I think my influence is much more indirect and limited, I think, because I do think that my statements get listened to by particularly leadership people, but lots of people within that movement, because for the most part, I think they recognize that I at least fully understand what they believe, and I think a basis for being criticized is that you have to believe that the person understands what it is you believe, and so I think that I have some impact there, but it's much more difficult to measure than an individual person who said, "Oh, I was wrong."
I have a follow-up to that. Thank you. Derek, you sort of danced around what's happened with you and your family of origin, and I'd love to hear more about what's happened since you split away from it, and are there any relationships? What's going on?
Condemning white nationalism meant to them condemning them and the relationship, and so for days afterwards it was very unclear whether we would ever communicate again. And it's been almost a decade since then, and it's always incredibly strained. There's lots of relatives who I haven't spoken to at all, who won't speak to me since then, and my parents, we have sort of a mutually tense and yet respectful every few times a year phone call conversations.
Hi. So you said that changing your beliefs at the end of the day wasn't the hard part, it was stepping out of your community. And you feared that, like you said, you felt like stepping into a void with nobody waiting there for you. Did your fears come true, or were you welcomed?
Both, because it was never the case that I could walk out of a community and just adopt some new space, because it's not how communities work. But it has been for me, it has been a long road, and the relationships that I've built are the most important ones in my life. Like, I've had experiences that I never would have imagined. I've spoken with people I never would have imagined understanding or knowing, and that continues. Connie's comment, that it's a better life. You make better people. To be open-minded, very true. But there was never a moment of like, oh, here's the new community. It was more of building individual relationships and, in some ways, restarting a life.
Other questions? Yeah.
There are a lot of guns in the USA, right? So, have you been scared because, like, maybe they called you a traitor, or I don't know?
I think especially initially there were, sort of violent threats, and it's something that I'm mindful of, and I have some security precautions. But I think it's somewhat dangerous to live in the United States in any case. And I think, I don't know, it's not something you can do a huge amount about. I think I have a lot of empathy also for white nationalists. I fully understand why they believe what they believe. I fully understand where the dehumanization of other people comes from. I know that they would be annoyed and offended to hear me say that, and hopefully somebody listens to, what does that mean, and ask themselves why, what are the consequences, and I think that's probably my primary feeling though. It's not an enemy relationship, it's something where they're the people who made me and built me, and I understand them as much as I understand anyone. And so I think I find it difficult to have any feeling other than sort of compassion and love.
Yeah, I think that, one of the, Allison and I have talked about that, and I think that, Derek, in some ways, you've said, at least early on, when we were talking, that because your father is one of the leaders of this movement, that might give you some protection, but I don't think that that's something that Allison necessarily agrees with, nor do I, so I think you should be more careful. So there you go. Steve?
Perhaps both of you all can answer this. I'm not sure if the question is applicable here, so if it is, I would love your thoughts on it as well. So Derek, to those of us who are trying to do the racial reconciliation work, given what you know, what would you tell us about where are our missteps? How would you reframe the conversation if you could? Are we having the right kinds of conversations? Are there missteps, misconceptions, well-intended wrong ways of approaching the conversation, but well-intended, given what you know? What kind of counsel do you give people trying to do the work?
I try to be slightly more humble than to answer that directly, but that I think I've had conversations with people doing anti-racist reconciliation sort of work, and the conversations, I think that sort of my experience informs the most is that it is easier, at least in an American context with a white audience, to advocate white nationalism than it is to advocate anti-racism. I will face much more pushback to anti-racism. You will face a feeling of shame that people have that causes them to lash back. Whereas a white nationalist's argument at its core is for white people to accept the status quo, to embrace a sense of entitlement, to say that there is nothing in critiques of racism other than just a naked insult. And white nationalism at its core tells people that nothing never needs to change, and anti-racism fundamentally challenges them. And I don't know how to solve that exactly, but that I think it can be a disconnect in the conversations. And I don't mean virulently racist white people. I mean just very normal, average, millions of them white people. I've seen how they react to a white nationalist message, and I've seen how they react to an anti-racist message, and there's more resistance to the latter.
And you want to comment before go ahead. You want to respond?
Well, I think I've been 10 years a youth worker. Since May, I do only do remembrance work full time. But you know, when we set up an evening event in Dublin, we reach every time the same people. Maybe someday there's one or two new people there who might not activists or really like engagiert, committed. Danke. So we need to find new ways to get more people in our rooms, in all of our rooms.
Yeah.
And I don't know how this should work. I think we need more discussions. We don't have to accept something that somebody is telling me, but I have to hear him, and we have to discuss about his viewings and my viewings. And I think there is a lot broken, and not only in Germany, I would say in the US as well, when I think about Republicans and Democrats. So yeah, but I don't have the right answer for that, but that's part of, and you will join me in Dublin, so we can show you on so many levels how we try to reach more and more people. It's the youth work, it's the work with immigrants, and also bringing immigrants and Germans together, and so on.
Yeah.
And I hope that some of these ideas project is the missing puzzle piece to get community together again.
So let's take one more, and I think it's down there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a question for both of you, but starting with Derek, I think we can feel here in the room that your story is very compelling. Everybody's listening to you, and I think this is this authenticity you're just embodying, and this inside knowledge. And based on that, I have a question also for Connie. I am sure, there must be like these kinds of Aussteigergeschichten, dropouts, is this the correct term in this? Leaving the community, this kind of community, also in Germany. So the first question for Connie would be, there must be something like this, like also people writing autobiographies like Derek, or starting to write them. And secondly, would you think that would help to bring these people together with these kinds of circles and to discuss the topics and the issues?
Well, I don't think, let's make it really practical. I have one guy in my hometown, he's a couple years younger than me, but he's a neo-Nazi since day one. He would never join such a meeting. So the first step, and I think that's also what Derek went through, the first step starts in this head. So he was crossing the bridge to go to these Shabbat dinners, and that's the first point. If that happens, of course, invite them and talk to them. We as an association still think we need to be a safe space. So we would never work with neo-Nazi skinheads. Our work is the prevention, to prevent kids or elderlies to, yeah, as I said before.
And I don't have any direct experience, but I know at least in the American context there are fairly public organizations that do this sort of de-radicalization work. And I don't have any insights into it, but I can say my personal experience is that people leave this movement all the time, but it is very, very rarely because they have embraced and changed their beliefs and their commitments. It's much, much more often because they want to lead a normal life. They want to leave it behind them, and so it tends to be pretty quiet, and it also tends to be not particularly inspiring, because if you find them and bump into them 10 years later, they'll tell you a bunch of racist and anti-Semitic things, and they just don't want to talk about it because they don't think it's that important in their lives anymore. And so I think that that's because that's some of the reality. You're not usually talking about a life change or an embrace of something completely different. And so I think it makes it slightly more complicated, at least from my perspective.
So we're going to break. It's hard to sort of put, a wrapper on this, because this is hard work. And as much as you have hard work in Germany, from an American perspective, we have such hard work to do. If you look at the next election in the United States, this ideology is pushing so hard that we might have a government that you're not even going to recognize. So it's very frightening. So we need to have these conversations. We need to figure out, every way possible for prevention and for building a common sense of community, which is going to be very hard with certain groups of people. Yet there are people on the fringe that are lonely and looking for a sense of belonging, and I think that is something that we're going to have to sort of work towards. So I thank you, all of you in this room, for the work of Widen the Circle, the work you're doing in your communities about memory. It's inspiring to us and the group that are here from the States. And I have to really thank the person who's been just doing such a good job of translation. And so I'm going to hand this back, but I want to give a huge applause to the two of you for agreeing to do this and sharing your perspective.
I already got one.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you, Marc, for asking sometimes very sensitive, always very sensitive, but sometimes rough questions. I think it's really bringing this conversation to a great point.